The stagecoach, a lumbering beast of scarred wood and strained leather, finally sighed to a halt, its iron-shod wheels grating against the hard-packed earth of Redemption Gulch. Ilara Gray clutched her small tapestry carpet bag, its faded roses a stark contrast to the utilitarian drabness of her travel-worn dress. Through the grimy window, the town appeared as a raw gash in an otherwise endless expanse of dun-colored prairie, a collection of unpainted buildings huddled beneath a sky too vast and too bright. A fragile hope, nurtured across desolate miles and lonely nights, fluttered in her chest, as thin and vulnerable as a newborn bird. She had come so far, pinning everything on the carefully penned letter from Mr. Alistair Finch, a name that had become synonymous with a future, a life beyond the choking dust of the textile mill and the gnawing ache of grief. She descended, her boots meeting the ground with a soft thud, sending up a puff of fine, alkaline dust that coated her worn hem. The air was thin and carried the scent of sun-baked wood, horse, and something faintly metallic. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more a declaration of stubborn human will against an indifferent landscape. Its main street, wide and rutted, was flanked by boardwalks that seemed to sag under the weight of unspoken histories. Ilara straightened her shoulders, a small, solitary figure against the backdrop of this raw, new world, her heart a drum against her ribs, beating a rhythm of apprehension and desperate anticipation. This was it, the beginning. Mr. Alistair Finch's emporium was the largest building, its false front aspiring to a grandeur the rest of the street could not support. Ilara approached, her gaze fixed on the name painted in stark black letters above the door. A bell jangled with a tinny sound as she pushed it open. The interior was dim, crammed with goods from bolts of calico to sacks of flour and gleaming tins of unknown provender. A portly man with a florid face and small, assessing eyes looked up from behind a cluttered counter. This had to be him. "Mr. Finch?" Her voice was softer than she intended, barely a whisper against the sudden silence of the store. He straightened, his gaze sweeping over her, from the cheap straw bonnet that did little to shield her from the sun, down to her sturdy, scuffed boots. His lips, fleshy and moist, pursed. "You'll be the arrival?" he asked, the word coated in a layer of something she couldn't quite name, something that made the small bird of hope in her chest falter. "Yes, sir, Ilara Gray, from Lowell, as per your letter." She offered a tentative smile, her hand instinctively going to the worn carpet bag, as if to prove her identity, her legitimacy. Finch's eyes narrowed, lingering on her hands where they clutched the bag. They were not the pale, delicate hands of a leisured woman. They were hands that knew work, reddened at the knuckles, with short, practical nails and skin roughened by years of thread and dye. A sneer began to form, twisting his mouth. "My letter," he said slowly, drawing the words out, "spoke of a lady, a woman of some refinement to share my establishment, my life." He gestured dismissively towards her. "I advertised for a companion, not a scullery maid, a field hand." The words struck Ilara with physical force, each one a stone hurled against her fragile expectations. The color drained from her face. "Sir, I am an honest woman. I can work." "The letter said you needed a wife, a partner." Her voice trembled, the carefully constructed composure of her journey crumbling. "A partner, yes." Finch boomed, his voice rising, drawing the attention of a woman examining thread at the far end of the counter, and a loafer who had been leaning against a barrel outside, now peering in. "But I did not solicit a laborer fresh from the factory floor. Look at those hands, those boots." He pointed, his finger an indictment. "You've come under false pretenses, girl. I'll not be made a fool of." Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over Ilara. Her cheeks burned. "There was no pretense, Mr. Finch. I am what I am. I can keep a good house. I can learn the business. I am willing." "Willingness is not the currency I deal in for a wife," he spat, turning his back on her, a gesture of final, brutal dismissal. "You are not what I require. You can see yourself out. The stage returns east in 3 days. I suggest you find a way to be on it." The air in the store seemed to solidify, pressing in on her, suffocating. The curious eyes of the other woman, the snickering glance of the loafer, they were like barbs. She stood frozen for a moment, the carpet-bag suddenly a leaden weight. Then, with a dignity she dredged from some deep, untouched well within her, she turned and walked out, the jangle of the bell mocking her retreat. The fierce afternoon sun struck her, blinding her to the few faces that turned to watch her, a solitary figure adrift in the vast, uncaring street. Redemption Gulch. It had offered none. The hours that followed were a blur of deepening despair. Ilara found herself on the frayed edge of the settlement, where the last, tentative structures gave way to the enormous, swallowing emptiness of the prairie. The wind whispered across the dry grasses, a mournful sound that echoed the desolation in her soul. It was a harsh land, this place, stark and unforgiving, the distant, flat-topped mesas like grim sentinels under a sky that offered no comfort, only an indifferent, metallic blue. The very earth seemed to reject her, reflecting the cold dismissal she had received from the one man who represented her only hope. She had tried the church, a small, whitewashed building with a leaning steeple. The preacher's wife, a woman with eyes as hard as pebbles and a mouth pursed in perpetual disapproval, had listened to a fractured version of Ilara's plight. She'd offered a thin broth of sympathy, laced with a strong suggestion that Ilara's presence in town, unattached and clearly destitute, was an impropriety that ought to be rectified by immediate departure. There was no room at their modest parsonage, of course, no practical help offered, only judgment veiled in piety. Later, driven by a gnawing hunger and a desperate need to find some corner to rest, she had neared the swinging doors of the saloon. The raucous laughter and tinny piano music that spilled out were a harsh counterpoint to her misery. The proprietor, a man with a stained apron and eyes that roamed over her with a predatory gleam, had made her skin crawl. She had backed away quickly, the unspoken offer in his gaze more terrifying than Finch's outright rejection. Each closed door, each cold stare, chipped away at her resilience, leaving her raw and exposed. Unseen by Ilara during Finch's cruel tirade, Caleb Thorne had been methodically loading sacks of grain onto his sturdy buckboard wagon near the livery stable. His face, weathered by sun and wind into a mask of stoic neutrality, had registered nothing, yet his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, had missed no detail of her public humiliation. He was a man of the land, more comfortable with the silence of the plains and the company of his cattle than with the petty cruelties of townsfolk. He knew Finch for what he was, a pompous little man whose wealth was newer than his manners. He had seen the flicker of spirit in the woman's eyes before Finch had crushed it. As twilight began to bleed across the immense sky, painting the prairie in hues of bruised purple and faded rose, Ilara found herself huddled near the livery. The smell of hay and manure was oddly comforting, a scent of honest labor, but the shadows were lengthening, and with them her fear. A few rough-looking men, drifting from the saloon, had cast speculative glances her way. She pulled her thin shawl tighter, trying to make herself invisible. A shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the man from the wagon, Caleb Thorne. He stood there, tall and lean, his expression unreadable in the fading light. For a long moment he said nothing, simply regarded her, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Got an empty line cabin," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, as if unused to regular speech. "Roof sound. Stove drawers, mostly." He gestured vaguely westward towards the darkening plains. No place for a woman, but its shelter. Ilara stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate, burgeoning relief. His offer was gruff, almost reluctant, yet his eyes, shadowed by the brim of his worn hat, lacked the leering interest or cold judgment she had encountered all day. He did not smile, did not cajole. He simply stated a fact. She was cold, exhausted, and the prospect of another night exposed to the elements, or worse, to the unwelcome attentions of men, was unbearable. What other choice did she have? She swallowed, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. A single tear, hot and unexpected, escaped and traced a slow path through the grime on her cheek. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. He merely grunted in acknowledgement, then turned towards his wagon. The decision was made, a desperate leap into another unknown, but this time under a sky that seemed, just for a moment, a fraction less hostile. The journey to the line cabin was made in near silence, the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves, the only sounds accompanying the sighing of the night wind. Ilara sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat beside Caleb Thorne, acutely aware of his stoic presence. He offered no conversation, and she, lost in a turmoil of exhaustion and trepidation, offered none in return. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a dark silhouette against a star-dusted sky, small and utterly isolated. Inside, by the flickering light of a lantern Caleb produced, it was starkly simple. A narrow cot with a thin mattress, a pot-bellied stove, a rough-hewn table, and a single, unsteady chair. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the air was cold and smelled faintly of disuse and mice. Yet, it had 4 walls and a roof. It was, as he had promised, shelter. He placed a few supplies on the table, a sack of flour, a slab of bacon, a tin of coffee, and a neatly folded coarse blanket. Water bucket by the door, creeks a short walk south. He stated, his gaze sweeping the small room. He did not linger. With a curt nod, he was gone, the sound of his retreating wagon fading into the vast, lonely darkness. Ilara sank onto the cot, the springs groaning in protest. The silence he left behind was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets outside and the frantic beating of her own heart. Caution was a cold knot in her stomach. This man, this Caleb Thorne, was a stranger. He had offered aid when no one else would, but she knew nothing of him, his motives. Yet, his quiet, almost impersonal manner had been a strange sort of comfort after Finch's bluster and the leering eyes of others. For now, this bare cabin was a sanctuary, however precarious. The following days established a strange, unspoken rhythm. Caleb Thorne lived in the main ranch house, a distant, sprawling structure she could barely discern on the horizon, perhaps a mile or more away. He came to the line cabin every 2 or 3 days, leaving supplies, a little more flour, some dried beans, occasionally a few eggs. He never entered without a clear, audible approach, never lingered. Their exchanges were minimal, a nod from him, a quiet thank you from her. Ilara, once the initial shock and exhaustion began to recede, found a measure of solace in work. She scrubbed the small cabin from top to bottom, chasing out the dust and the lingering scent of neglect. She found a discarded tin can and filled it with hardy prairie wildflowers, their vibrant yellows and purples, a small defiance against the cabin's drabness. She mended the tear in her dress with meticulous stitches, her needle a familiar comfort in her hand. These small acts of domesticity were an assertion of her presence, her refusal to be entirely erased. She observed Caleb from a distance when he came. His movements were economical, his face usually set in lines of concentration or weariness. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to the relentless demands of the land. She noticed the way he checked the horizon, the way his hands, strong and calloused like her own, handled the reins or hefted a sack of feed. One morning, he left a pail of still warm milk outside her door. Another afternoon, a small basket of wind-fallen apples, bruised but sweet. These were acts of kindness, unadorned by words, and they slowly, painstakingly, began to build a fragile bridge of trust across the chasm of their initial unfamiliarity. She, in turn, began to leave a small pot of freshly brewed coffee on the edge of the porch for him on the mornings she knew he might pass by on his way to check distant fences. He never acknowledged it directly, but the pot was always empty when he left. Weeks bled into a month. The raw edges of Ilara's despair began to soften, replaced by a cautious, tentative hope. One evening, the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue all day, turned a bruised, ominous grey. The wind rose, howling like a hungry wolf around the small cabin, and then the storm broke with a primal fury. Rain lashed against the single window, and thunder cracked overhead, each clap like the shattering of worlds. Ilara, huddled on her cot, found herself trembling uncontrollably. The violent, percussive sounds dredged up half-forgotten terrors from her childhood. The deafening roar of the mill machinery, the sudden, shocking clang of a broken loom that had once injured a friend. A loud knock on the door made her jump. It was Caleb, his slicker dripping, his face etched with concern in the dim light. "Figured you might need checking on," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm's tumult. He saw her pale face, the way she flinched at each thunderclap. Awkwardly, he stepped inside, letting the door slam shut against the wind. He did not sit, just stood near the stove, a solid, reassuring presence in the chaotic night. The storm raged for hours. In the lulls between the thunder, a strange sort of peace settled in the small cabin. Prompted by his quiet patience, or perhaps by the shared vulnerability of the moment, Ilara found herself speaking. In a low, hesitant voice, she told him about Lowell, about the endless, grinding hours in the mill that had stolen her youth, about the deaths of her parents that had left her utterly alone, about the desperate hope she had invested in Alistair Finch's promise. She spoke of her calloused hands, not as a mark of shame, as Finch had seen them, but as a testament to her endurance. Caleb listened, his usual stoicism softened by a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He said little, but his silence was attentive, not dismissive. When she finally fell silent, the storm beginning to abate, he spoke, his voice quiet. "Lost my Martha, and our boy, Fever, years back." He gestured vaguely around the cabin, then towards the unseen main house. "Ranch has been quiet. Too quiet, sometimes." It was a brief, stark revelation of his own sorrow, his own reasons for the solitude that clung to him like a second skin. In that shared moment of revealed pain, the fragile bridge between them gained a surprising strength. The storm outside eventually rumbled into the distance, leaving behind a washed-clean world and a new, deeper understanding within the small, sheltered cabin. A semblance of normalcy, fragile as a spider's web in morning dew, began to weave itself into the fabric of Ilara's days. With Caleb's unspoken permission, she had scratched out a small patch of earth near the cabin, coaxing stubborn life from the prairie soil. Tiny green shoots of beans and squash were emerging, symbols of her own tentative rerouting. When Caleb brought supplies, his eyes would sometimes linger on the small, tended plot, a silent acknowledgement of her industry. She found herself anticipating his visits, not with fear, but with a quiet sort of expectation. One day, she noticed a long tear in the sleeve of his rough work shirt. Without a word, she took it from him when he next appeared, and by the following day it was mended, the stitches neat and almost invisible. He accepted it back with a gruff nod, but she saw a flicker of surprise, perhaps even gratitude, in his eyes. It was a small thing, yet it felt significant, a shift in their dynamic from rescuer and rescued to something more akin to partnership. A quiet routine settled. He provided, she contributed in the small ways she could. The raw tension that had initially filled the spaces between them began to ease, replaced by a comfortable, if largely unspoken, mutual reliance. Glimmers of peace, even contentment, started to touch Ilara's heart. But the insular world they had begun to create could not remain untouched by the larger, more judgmental world of Redemption Gulch. Alistair Finch, his pride deeply wounded by Ilara's continued presence in the vicinity, a presence he had not anticipated when he cast her out, began to nurse a bitter resentment. He could not abide the thought that the woman he had deemed unworthy had found refuge, particularly with a man like Caleb Thorne, whose quiet self-sufficiency Finch mistook for arrogance. Whispers started in town, insidious and ugly, fueled by Finch's pointed remarks and the fertile imaginations of the idle. That Thorne fellow, keeping a woman out on his land, not proper. She must be one of those types, rejected by decent folk. The gossip, like a noxious weed, took root and spread. Ilara rarely went into Redemption Gulch. There was no reason to. But Caleb, on his infrequent trips for essential supplies he couldn't produce on the ranch, began to encounter coolness where before there had been indifference and outright disapproval from some. The storekeeper's wife, a woman whose piety was as starched as her apron, sniffed loudly when he entered, her gaze sliding past him as if he were invisible. One Sunday, Deacon Miller, a man whose face seemed permanently set in lines of stern condemnation, made a special trip out to the Thorne Ranch. He found Ilara tending her small garden, her hands covered in rich earth. The deacon cleared his throat portentously. "Mr. Thorne," he began, addressing Caleb, who had emerged from the barn, "concerns have been raised. About this arrangement." He gestured vaguely towards Ilara, his meaning clear. "It is not seemly, for the good of the community, for the young woman's own reputation." Before the deacon could continue his sanctimonious pronouncements, Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara. His voice, when he spoke, was low, but it carried the weight of iron. "She's under my protection, deacon, and on my land. That's all you need to know. Or anyone else." His eyes, usually so guarded, held a glint of steel. The deacon, flustered by this unexpected and firm rebuttal from the usually taciturn rancher, mumbled something about Christian duty and beat a hasty retreat. Later that week, Finch himself, emboldened by what he perceived as growing public censure of Thorne and Ilara, confronted her near the creek where she went to draw water. He appeared suddenly from behind a copse of willows, his face flushed with self-righteous anger. "Still here, are you?" he sneered. "Thought a woman of your character would have moved on. Or did you think you could trap Thorne with your womanly wiles?" Ilara, startled and frightened, clutched her water bucket. "I have done nothing to you, Mr. Finch. Please, leave me be." Just as Finch took a menacing step towards her, Caleb emerged from the cottonwoods, silent as a shadow. He didn't touch Finch, didn't raise his voice, but his presence, tall and unyielding, was a palpable threat. "Leave her be, Finch," Caleb said, his voice flat and dangerous, "or you'll answer to me." Finch, a bully at heart, paled and backed away, muttering curses under his breath. The incident, however, solidified Caleb's resolve to shield Ilara more definitively. The next time he was in Finch's emporium for supplies, and the storekeeper's wife began a sly insinuation about women who live in sin, Caleb cut her short. He looked her directly in the eye, his voice carrying clearly through the store. "Miss Ilara," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument, "is to be my wife. Best you remember that." A stunned silence fell. It was a lie, a shield forged in the moment, but it served its purpose. The gossip did not entirely cease, but it became more furtive, less bold. He had drawn a line in the sand, publicly. Finch, however, was not a man to be easily deterred, especially when his public standing and masculine pride felt so thoroughly challenged. Caleb's bold declaration in the Emporium, a lie though Ilara knew it to be for her protection, had only fanned the flames of Finch's fury. He seethed at the idea that the labor girl he had rejected was now apparently set to marry Thorne, a man Finch secretly envied for his sprawling ranch, however run down Finch perceived it to be. He could not bear being made the fool, the man whose judgment was so poor he cast off a woman, another man, even an eccentric like Thorne, would claim. Driven by a venomous cocktail of spite and wounded vanity, Finch began to gather a claque of malcontents. These were men who haunted the smoky corners of the saloon, men with little to lose and a simmering resentment for anyone who seemed to possess more than they did, whether it was land, like Thorne, or simple dignity, like Ilara. Finch, plying them with cheap whiskey and poisonous rhetoric, painted Ilara as a designing woman and Thorn as a fool who needed to be taught a lesson for upsetting the town's moral fabric. Their mutterings soon solidified into a crude plan. They would run Ilara out of the county, burn her little cabin as a warning, and show Thorn that Redemption Gulch would not tolerate such defiance of its unwritten codes. One moonless night, the dogs at Thorn's main house began to bark, a frantic, aggressive sound that sliced through the prairie silence. Caleb, instantly alert, was out of bed in a flash, pulling on his boots, his rifle in hand. He knew that kind of barking. Trouble. He headed towards the line cabin at a run, his heart a cold knot of dread. Ilara, too, had heard the dogs, then the distant, drunken shouts. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile peace she had cultivated. She peered through a crack in the cabin's rough-hewn door and saw them, a knot of perhaps 5 or 6 men, their forms intermittently illuminated by the guttering light of several torches they carried. Finch was at their head, his face contorted with malice. Just as the first of them reached the small clearing around the cabin, Caleb burst from the shadows, his rifle held ready. "That's far enough, Finch," his voice rang out, hard as granite. The men halted, momentarily surprised by his sudden appearance. Finch, regaining his bluster, shouted, "We've come for the woman, Thorn. She's a blight on this town. We're here to cleanse it." Ilara, her initial terror warring with a surge of defiant anger, did not cower. She unlatched the door and stepped out to stand beside Caleb. In her hand, she gripped the heavy iron skillet she used for cooking, its weight a small reassurance. Her voice trembled, but it was clear and carried in the tense air. "We have done nothing to you. This is our home. You have no right." The sight of her, small but resolute, standing shoulder to shoulder with the armed rancher, gave some of the men pause. This was not the frightened, easily scattered creature they had perhaps envisioned. Caleb kept his rifle steady, his gaze sweeping over the torch-bearing group. "You take one more step towards this cabin or this woman," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "and I'll not be responsible for the consequences. Get off my land." Facing the barrel of Caleb's rifle and the unexpected fire in Ilara's eyes, the drunken courage of Finch's cronies began to waver. One or two at the back started to shuffle nervously. Finch, however, consumed by his rage, screamed, "She's a whore, and you're a fool, Thorn." He lunged forward. Caleb moved with surprising speed, not firing, but using the rifle butt to deflect Finch's clumsy attack, sending him sprawling into the dust. The other men, seeing their leader so easily dispatched and clearly unwilling to face a determined, armed man, began to back away, their bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. They mumbled, turned, and then broke into a ragged retreat, their torches casting bobbing, fearful lights as they hurried back towards the distant, feeble glow of town. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Ilara's legs felt like water. The skillet clattered from her trembling hand. Caleb lowered his rifle, his breathing harsh. He turned to her, his face grim in the faint starlight. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She could only nod, tears of reaction stinging her eyes. He had defended her, risked himself for her, and she, in her own small way, had stood with him. In that shared crucible of fear and defiance, the unspoken bonds between them were forged anew, tempered into something strong and undeniable. He had received a glancing blow from one of the retreating men, a cut above his eye that was now beginning to bleed. Without a word, she gently took his arm and led him into the cabin. There, by the light of the lamp, she carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound, her touch surprisingly tender. The pretense of a mere arrangement, of a protective lie, had burned away in the light of the torches, leaving behind a raw, profound connection. As she finished, their eyes met, and in the depths of his, she saw a vulnerability, a gratitude that mirrored her own. The night had been terrifying, but it had also irrevocably changed them, binding them together in a way neither had anticipated. Alistair Finch, humiliated by his ignominious rout and the desertion of his so-called allies, was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. His hatred for Ilara and Caleb now festered into a dangerous obsession. He could not physically intimidate them, so he turned to the only weapon he had left: his perceived standing as a respectable businessman and his ability to manipulate public opinion and, perhaps, pliable authority. He began to petition the nascent town council, a loose body of influential citizens, including the deacon and the storekeeper, demanding Ilara's official removal as a vagrant and a woman of questionable morals, whose presence, he argued, was detrimental to the town's good name and future prospects. He painted Caleb as a recluse whose judgment was clearly impaired. A town meeting was called, ostensibly to discuss matters of public order. It was to be held in the largest open space available, the area in front of the half-built new meeting hall. Word spread quickly. Finch had ensured it. This was to be his stage, his moment of vindication. Caleb learned of it from a sympathetic livery owner who quietly advised him to attend, to speak for himself and for Ilara. On the appointed day, Caleb and Ilara walked into Redemption Gulch together. A small crowd had gathered, a mixture of the curious, the judgmental, and a few who remained carefully neutral. Finch stood near the makeshift podium, his face flushed with a sense of impending triumph. He launched into his diatribe, his voice full of righteous indignation, rehashing old accusations, twisting facts, painting Ilara as a deceitful opportunist and Caleb as her deluded protector. He spoke of community standards, of decency, of the need to protect Redemption Gulch from undesirable elements. When he finally finished, a tense silence fell. All eyes turned to Caleb and Ilara. Caleb merely stood, his presence a silent rebuke to Finch's venom. It was Ilara who stepped forward, her hands clasped before her, not in supplication, but for composure. Her voice, though not loud, carried with a startling clarity and conviction. "I came to this town seeking a new life," she began, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, meeting eyes, holding them. "I came in good faith, answering a summons. I was met with cruelty and public rejection, for no greater crime than the evidence of honest labor on my hands." She held them up, palms outward. "These hands," she said, her voice ringing with emotion, "have spun thread to clothe you, perhaps. They have tilled soil, cooked meals, mended garments. They are not the hands of a thief or a liar. They are the hands of a woman who has always worked, who has always sought to earn her way with dignity." She turned towards Finch, her eyes blazing. "You, Mr. Finch, judged me by the texture of my skin, by the plainness of my dress. You saw a laborer, and you assumed a lack of worth, a lack of character. Is honest work a sin in this town? Is it a crime to seek shelter when one is cast out? Is kindness, such as that shown to me by Mr. Thorne, something to be condemned?" Her words, simple and direct, resonated through the crowd. She spoke not just of her own plight, but of a larger principle, of fairness, of looking beyond superficial appearances to the true measure of a person. "Mr. Thorne offered me shelter when I had none. He asked for nothing in return. He has treated me with respect, a courtesy you, Mr. Finch, seem incapable of understanding. If he is a fool, then this town needs more such fools. If I am a blight, it is a blight born of your own making, your own prejudice." Caleb stepped forward then, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He looked at the crowd, then directly at Finch. "She speaks the truth," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This woman has more honor, more decency, and more courage in her little finger than Alistair Finch possesses in his entire being. She has worth, and she is staying on my land. With me." His declaration was unequivocal. A murmur went through the crowd. Ilara's passionate defense and Caleb's steadfast, quiet support had a profound effect. The preacher, who had initially been swayed by Deacon Miller's concerns, now looked troubled, his gaze resting on Finch with a new understanding. An older woman, Martha Henderson, known for her sharp tongue but fair mind, and who had once given Ilara a cold look, spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "That man," she said, pointing a gnarled finger at Finch, "shamed himself that day at the Emporium, not the girl. We all saw it. He's just too proud to admit he misjudged her character." Another voice, a farmer whose property bordered Thorne's, added, "Finch's cronies were out at Thorne's place the other night, looking for trouble. I saw their torches. Thorne and the lady here, they just want to be left in peace." The tide was turning. Finch, seeing his support crumbling, his face turning a mottled red, began to sputter, but his words were lost in a rising chorus of disapproval. The hastily appointed town marshal, a young man who had been wavering, now stepped forward. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice holding a new authority, "it seems to me there are no grounds for removing Miss Grey, and I'd advise you to cease this harassment. Let these people be." Finch, his face a mask of fury and defeat, knew he had lost. He was isolated, his cruelty and hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. The immediate threat from Alistair Finch dissolved like smoke in the prairie wind. Publicly discredited, his attempt to rally the town against Ilara and Caleb had backfired spectacularly. His few remaining cronies melted back into the shadows of the saloon, no longer eager to associate with a man so thoroughly exposed and humiliated. A palpable sense of relief settled over Ilara, heavy and sweet as summer rain after a long drought. The relentless pressure, the constant looking over her shoulder, began to ease. She felt as though she could finally breathe again, truly breathe. A few days after the town meeting, as the dust settled both literally and figuratively, Caleb found Ilara by the creek, not drawing water, but simply watching the gentle flow, a small, peaceful smile on her face. He stood beside her for a long moment, the comfortable silence that had grown between them now deeper, richer. "Ilara," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. She turned to him, her eyes questioning. "That declaration I made in town, about you being my wife." He paused, searching for the right words, a rare occurrence for the usually taciturn man. "It started as a shield for you, but it ain't just that anymore, not for me." He took one of her calloused hands in his own. "This ranch," he said, his gaze sweeping over the land that stretched around them, "it ain't much, still needs a lot of work. And I ain't much of a talker, but it's a better place with you here. My life, it's better with you in it." He looked directly into her eyes, his own earnest and sincere. "Will you marry me, Ilara, for real this time, not for protection, but because, well, because I'd like you to be my wife?" Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, unexpected joy. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, yes, I will." They were married quietly by the preacher, who now looked upon them with genuine warmth and respect. Martha Henderson and the farmer who had spoken up for them stood as witnesses. There were no frills, no fancy celebration, just a simple ceremony in the small church, followed by a shared meal at the preacher's house, where even his once stern wife offered Ilara a tentative smile and a piece of her best apple pie. Life on the Thorne Ranch began to transform. Together, Ilara and Caleb started to truly build a home. They worked side by side, clearing more land for a larger garden, repairing fences, even adding a new room to the main ranch house, which slowly shed its air of neglect and began to feel like a place of warmth and shared purpose. Ilara's quiet dignity, her unwavering kindness, and her tireless industry gradually earned her not just acceptance, but genuine respect from the decent folk of Redemption Gulch. She found an inner peace she had never known, a deep-seated sense of self-worth that no amount of hardship could now erode. She belonged. Their home, once a symbol of Caleb's solitary existence and Ilara's desperate refuge, slowly became something more. It became a quiet testament to resilience and the unexpected blossoming of love in harsh terrain. Years later, Their quiet life was enriched further when they took in a pair of orphaned children, a brother and sister left stranded by a wagon train tragedy, offering them the same shelter and kindness Ilara had once so desperately needed. Ilara, who had arrived with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a shattered dream, found herself a wife, a mother, a respected member of a community that had once judged her so harshly. Her nurturing spirit, once suppressed by hardship, now flourished, extending beyond her own family to touch others in need. The final image of their days was often one of quiet contentment. Ilara and Caleb, older now, their faces etched with the lines of lives lived fully and not without struggle, would sit on the porch of their thriving ranch house as the sun dipped below the vast horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and deep violet. Her hands, still calloused, rested in his, a silent acknowledgement of all they had weathered and all they had built together. They were hands that had known hardship, yes, but they were also hands that had cultivated life, offered comfort, and held fast to love. The sprawling landscape, once a symbol of her desolation and vulnerability, now cradled them in its immense, peaceful embrace, a testament to their hard-won happiness and the enduring power of the human spirit to find belonging, even in the most unforgiving of places. Redemption Gulch, in the end, had offered a different kind of redemption, not an escape from the past, but the chance to build a future worthy of the name.